Good thing no one had fruits on them, I think. Good to go? I think so. Alrighty, cool. Well, enough of that, right? Jeez, tough crowd. Rightio, so the next presentation we have, oh, my slides didn't update. My apologies.
Do you remember who I am?
Oh, I know who you are. I just want to talk about your presentation, so I'll wait for this to update, and there we go. So we have Mark Carey-Smith. He has an information security. He has been an information security professional for approximately 20 years. And we also have Alex Webling, who's the Director of Resilience Outcomes Australia, a consultancy helping businesses and governments meet their strategic challenges in organizational resilience, security governance, privacy, and information security. So Mark also has worked in operational and architecture InfoSec roles, as well as lecturing. His current focus is governance, risk, and compliance, with particular passion on cybersecurity education, awareness, and cultural improvement. Right, so I was fortunate enough to be part of the training session yesterday where Mark and Alex were talking through leading cybersecurity assurance. So this is a fantastic course that's been like squished down into a very short presentation at the very last minute of sorts. So I'm very much looking forward to revisiting some of the information, so maybe things that I missed. So thank you very much. I'll give them a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucas. So sorry for anybody who was actually expecting a different presentation. You're stuck with Alex and I. And while we're on apologies, I'd like to apologise to anybody who attended our workshop yesterday and is expecting to hear anything different today, because that's not going to happen.
We're going to speak faster. Sorry.
Yes, we're just going to condense about 6 hours worth of material into 35 minutes. No problem. If someone could shut that door for me, that would be super duper awesome. Thank you. If you haven't had a chance to do that, to go to menti.com and enter that code, could you please do that really quickly? So, to begin with, we'd like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the country on which we are meeting today. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and just would like to acknowledge the fact that these lands have always been places of education and sharing information. So, what is assurance from a cybersecurity perspective? Let's take a look at our word cloud that you've all had so long to fill in. You could go a little bit quicker. It'd be good. So the great thing about
Wi-Fi. It may be the Wi-Fi.
It could be. The code's 13360463. Please. Look, the thing I really love about word clouds is that you can get immediate input from your audience and you can see what the different perspectives are in the room. Mentimeter is what we're using today. This is the free version. It still gives you good functionality. It's a really good way to engage with your audience, whatever kind of training or engagement you're doing, especially good with executive stakeholders because they get to play with their devices and you get to see what their opinions are in an anonymous-ish kind of fashion. And it looks cool as it resizes itself. Obviously, the bigger fonts are words in common. So that's great. That's good to hear. Thank you. Mark is a legend. Is particularly observant comment. Well done, Lucas. I'll give you that money later on. All right. Let's go back to the actual preso. So, look, there's lots of different definitions about assurance, but here's a good one. Information security assurance provides objective assessment as to the security of information. The Institute of Internal Auditors, the IIA, revised their 3 lines of defence model a few years ago. You might be familiar with the previous one. This is the updated one. It's now just called the 3 lines model. The previous one was seen as being too narrowly focused on just defence and stopping bad things from occurring. So the updated model is a little bit more flexible, and it more accurately reflects the way that roles and responsibilities of the different parties associated with assurance need to work together and communicate and understand responsibilities and accountabilities. So this is definitely an improvement, particularly around role clarity and the way that responsibility and accountability should be clearly communicated, because that's so critical to assurance. And it's flexible enough for people to customise it in a way that's going to suit their individual context. So how much assurance is enough assurance? Well, ultimately, you'd want assurance to be commensurate with the business impacts of whatever information asset or system we're talking about that needs assurance. This is an example from a Queensland Government document about assurance and information security classification. These are just examples, right? The whole point of this document and these kinds of documents is that this needs to be correct for the context in which it's going to be used, especially within the context of the risk appetite of the risk owners. Ultimately, they're the people that are accountable for risk, the management of risk, so they should have good input into how much assurance is enough assurance. Of course, sometimes some stakeholders may want more assurance than information security professionals might think is warranted, or perhaps sometimes they might not want as much assurance as you might think is a good idea. Either way, you have to adapt yourself to suit the required circumstances. You know, managing up is an important skill. And you have to adapt it to suit the circumstances, suit the context. Alex.
Thank you, sir. Right, where are we? Oh, yeah. So aligning on the ground. I suppose from what Lucas said, you know, I spend a lot of my time going into organisations as the virtual CISO for 6 to 12 months and trying to help them with improve their governance and then ideally let go and let them stand up on their own 2 feet and keep on going and improve what they're doing. It's really important to have a clear plan when you are walking into a new organisation, whether you're going to be there for the long term or, as I tend to be, there for a shorter term, because you only have a very short amount of time to make change, and you want to make change stick as much as you can, and to make the organisation that you are responsible for as the CISO or CSO increasingly in organisations as good as it can be for its organisation. So a couple of things. The first 6 months plan is really important, as I said. You're going to be bombarded with lots of ideas from many stakeholders, including malcontents. Some of your information that you receive in your first days, weeks, months is going to be crap. Some of it is going to be brilliant. It's going to be really difficult to filter that out. Be cautious with how you do it. There's pressure to perform, of course. And so how do you succeed in your new organisation that you're trying to help? And the big idea is ultimately trying to build the aeroplane whilst flying. You're trying to do your strategic changes in the organisation over your time, but you've also got to do all your tactical stuff at the same time as well. You've got to keep everything flying, everything running, and quite often it's ugly in the first few weeks. These are some things that I think are really useful in your first weeks and months to think about from my perspective. And this is in no particular order, and other people do things slightly differently as well. So some of the questions you need to be asking yourself: who has organisational power within your organisation? There's formal and informal power. Usually an organisation will have a structural chart and you'll know who your boss is and your boss's boss, and that's really obvious. But you should also start being curious about who the other bosses are and who your cohort are that you're going to be talking to. But also really, really importantly, particularly in smaller organisations, is what you might call informal power. You know, who are the people who have a lot of the knowledge within the organisation on what's done and how's it done, particularly if it's a smaller organisation and they don't document anything. I'm sure there are none of those here that you know of around the place. It's important to get to know those people. The price of a coffee, can I suggest, is super valuable on people around the place. Talking to those people, talking to HR, starting to talk to audit, starting to talk to people who are doing FizSec and PerSec, if those people exist. That's a big question to answer. Talking to the people who are in charge of finance. Of course, the other question that you have to ask is what is the incident response capability? And you have to start doing one-on-ones. If you don't know what one-on-ones are, ask that question and we'll answer it at the end of the preso. So, does anybody know what that number is? 207 days is the average time according to Poneman in the 2020 report. You know, your experience may vary. It's around 8 months between an organisation discovering that it's been owned and day zero. So that means the moment that you turn up at an organisation, you've got a clock ticking backwards for 8 months. So that's why IR is a really important thing to start as soon as you absolutely can. So, big questions. What incident response capability plans exist? Why? As I said, you're accountable, if not responsible, from day one. It's a sad story, but that's why they pay you the big bucks. You may already be breached. My approach is always simple, dumb, direct questions. I know a lot of you look a lot smarter, but just play dumb is my advice. And again, use coffee, tea, whatever beverage of choice. You know, the questions like, I'm new here, tell me how you do this. Tell me when you last. Questions like cyber exercised, when you last detected something, when you last scanned, how do you do vulnerability scanning? Just really dumb, you know, open-ended questions. Let's have a conversation, not, you know, show us this, you know, hard stuff. You can get to that if you need to later. Just start soft. Okay, stakeholders and stakeholder analysis. In the talk yesterday, we spent quite a bit of time talking about stakeholder analysis. In larger organisations, particularly when you know that you're going to go through a big change process, say you're starting to work in an organisation like defence or a really big multinational or stuff like that, you're going to have to go through a change management program. Now, there will be experts that can help you, but it helps to actually start thinking about, well, which stakeholders matter. We started talking about informal and formal power. Well, you need to start working out who are the stakeholders who matter. If you're going to make a change, you're going to have to make some changes whichever way you want, either because the organisation needs to respond to the changing threat environment, because it's a perfect organisation, but it needs to keep on being a perfect, resilient organisation, or because it's a substandard organisation and you want to improve it as much as it can be so that it can respond to the changing threat environment. So which stakeholders matter? And you can categorise those people as people broadly who who can help you, who can hinder you, who don't care, and such like. And there's a lot of science in there, and there are a lot of people who can help you with that sort of stuff, but you should be asking those sorts of questions. This is important. Mark talked about risk appetite and risk tolerance. You need to be starting to align your organisational security objectives to whatever the risk tolerance is within the organisation. That's really, really important, because you need to sort of at least say, well, this is the direction we want to take. The security approach that you're going to take as an organisation, I don't know, let's use an example. I always like using the fish and chip shop, is not the same as if you are a defence establishment. So, and of course there are advantages and disadvantages in both. So you need to actually sort of cut your cloth. And also in terms of your discussion with which stakeholders matter, this is about part of getting organisational support for the inevitable changes that you're going to have to make at that CISO level. Don't ever go into one of these organisations and say, we're not going to ever have to change, because you'll be left behind. And of course, lots of people have talked about identifying meaningful measures and metrics. They tend to be different for different organisations, and both qualitative and quantitative measures and metrics are really useful. Building the case for change, this is all part of that. And again, still over the 6 months, you still have to keep that aeroplane flying. You still have to keep on doing all that tactical stuff. So you have to then start thinking about, well, your team needs to be better so that you can give them all the jobs that they can do, so that you can have the headspace to be doing all the stuff at the top of those points. Because the better your team is, the better you can be. So delegation and coaching, passing on those tasks, making sure that people are doing stuff so that you are free to have the headspace to do that strategic thinking, that strategic approach. Okay, those of you who know me know that I like talking about Goldilocks security. Not too much, not too little, just right. Incredibly hard to achieve, but it's a nice little sort of thing to talk about. And again, this is very much the shorthand of aligning organisational objectives to what your tolerance and your risk appetite is within the organisation. This is what is the scope of security within your organisation. And the point that has to be made is that security as a function, as an entity, doesn't decide what that is. It should be an expert advice. It should provide its view. But ultimately, the risk owner, i.e. the CEO, the minister, the director general, whoever it is, and his or her leadership team, however that's described in the organisation, has to do that. Of course, they need to be advised. Of course, they need to be, given as much good guidance as you can. You as almost the translator for security of what the implications of their decisions are likely to be. But the ultimate decision maker has to be the risk owner. And if it goes wrong, they have to wear it. So, and somehow in some ways I'm repeating what I'm saying here, but it's worth saying it in a slightly different way, that the security at risk appetite varies by the organisation. Of course, it's very similar across industries, so the appetite will be very similar in banks of a similar size, in insurance agencies of a similar size, in intelligence agencies of a similar size and type and such like. And of course, it's not fixed, because we all know that the threat environment continues to change. So that risk appetite is going to change, and you have to keep on top of it. So your risk tolerance also has to reflect the acceptable variation in the outcomes related to specific performance. measures linked to objectives the entity seeks to achieve. So there is a difference, and I think that sometimes we forget that there is quite a big difference between what appetite is and tolerance. And hopefully this diagram actually sort of gives you some idea of what that difference is. So the appetite is the amount of risk that the organisation is willing to take on a particular, in pursuit of its particular business aims. So this might be reflected in an organisation willing to invest and take a $100 million risk on a particular project. The risk tolerance is the variance in that, effectively, to bear the risk if it goes wrong. And the risk capacity, that's the overall risk that can be taken by the organisation. So, as an example, a government may have a budget of $3 billion. So, in a year, potentially its risk capacity could be as large as that. But, of course, it doesn't want to take that much risk if it doesn't have to. Sorry. Okay. Risk appetite statement traps. We've all seen bad risk appetite statements. I have a real bugbear for certain things. One of my biggest one is the statement, we have zero tolerance for something, right? If you ever see this in a risk appetite statement, you know that whoever wrote it doesn't know what they're talking about. Because effectively, if somebody says that they have zero appetite to do something, they won't do it, right? So if an organisation has zero appetite for fraud, then it shouldn't be dealing with finances. So let's just, okay, rant mode off. Okay. Risk is simple in theory. There are only 4 options effectively that you can do. You can mitigate, control, you can accept or transfer and share, right? And I suppose if there is zero tolerance, you can avoid the risk. You can stop doing an activity, and that is effectively your choice of zero tolerance. That's the only time you have zero tolerance to do something. If you have very few options as a risk manager for what you can do, and there's always some element of risk in anything you do, in crossing the road, in walking up the stairs or whatever. You might have zero tolerance for tripping, but that doesn't matter if you decide to go up the stairs. Of course, the other thing is risk appetite statements that don't tell it like it is, that in some way tell some sort of fanciful fairy story about the organisation. That's not good for them. It's not good for you as a security executive within the organisation, because what it does is it holds you to unreal expectations. It's sort of like the zero tolerance statement. And the last one, which happens an awful lot, is ones that are too vague and not practically applicable. A risk appetite statement should be really difficult to do. It should take the board of executives a lot of argument to come at. Well done, it should be quite fine-grained in terms of saying, well, we as an organisation are willing to take a particular risk in a particular way. The other point is the lack of delegation of risk or risk tolerance within the organisation. By that I mean that obviously in some organisations, they decide that they're going to take a particular. The easy ones are probably financial risk. Maybe that organisation says that the board can sign off on $100 million financial risk. And we're all familiar, I think, with financial delegations, and we're quite comfortable with that. And that's the embodiment of a risk appetite. But we rarely see that in broader security risk. That the a certain level is able to take a certain security risk, a higher level is able to take a certain higher risk. You do see it in the military. In the DSPF, it actually allows certain ranks to be responsible for classification of documents, and that reflects both the overclassification of information and the underclassification of information. But it's rare to see it in many other contexts within the organisations. Okay. Defining and implementing meaningful metrics. There is probably no one perfect metric for any one organisation. It's usually the best advice is what is being used within the industry, within the field, and within the organisation itself. If your organisation is using exclusively NIST frameworks, then try and use them, because then you can speak the same language as them. If your organisation is using ISO standards, then use the ISO standards. In the end, they're all trying to come at the same thing, and in the end, none of them are perfect. And we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Be cautious about quantitative or only using quantitative metrics. What I have seen personally is people arguing the point difference on quantitative metrics, and what that means is, one person saying it's a 4.5 and the other person saying it's a 5, and that might mean the difference between two completely different actions, when what you're actually saying is on a scale they're pretty close, and one's a little bit left of the other one. And that's where often qualitative metrics can be useful in terms of actually having a look at some of these things. But both done well can help. Baselining is helpful as well because it gives you a line in the sand. It allows you to celebrate your achievements. Particularly if I go back to where I was talking about, you have to implement change as a CISO. One of the big things, for those of you who came yesterday, we talked about Cotter. Cotter is my favourite change management hero of how you do change management. One of the big things is create wins along the way for your change management. If you can actually find ways of celebrating wins in your change process, even if you're not quite finished or close to, that's really good, because it gives that psychological impetus for people to go and do that final lift over the top or to the top of the Everest, or however you want to use that description. As I said, there's lots of maturity assessment frameworks. Mark made the point that some of these are probably not technically maturity assessment frameworks, but really use them. But don't think that they are necessarily the perfection. They are useful tools. They are not necessarily the be-all and end-all. One thing that's really useful is keeping an eye on trending figures, trending metrics rather than absolute metrics. Is the organisation improving rather than is it, X number? This is worth just emphasising in terms of when you are working at the CISO level. Biases, we all have them. Anchoring confirmation over confidence. If you go into the literature, there are hundreds of biases. Unfortunately, we're human. We're just above bonobos. So, live with it. The problem is that in crises, they can be accentuated. We have effectively two brains. We have a brain that works mostly in crises. You might call that type 1 thinking brain, and that is reactive, fear-based and such like. That is the brain that takes over in a crisis. If security is being done, of course, it is boring, repetitive, and just day-to-day, and everything's calm. But of course, it never is. And the problem is that you can make critical errors of judgment if you are not aware of your biases. Don't be afraid of them. We all have them. We're chimpanzees. This document here, which you can find, site:/.gov.au, Decision Making During a Crisis Practical Guide, is really good. It talks a lot about that. Don't know how much, running out of time. This comes from that document. It talks about the processes for decision making during a crisis. Talks about psychological safety, making sure that you are removing biases as much as you can in your decision making, managing expectations, and making sure that you're confirming authority and direction and such like. Really useful. Recommend it. Use it, please. All yours.
Yeah, that document that Alex was just referring to, it's extremely well written, and it's so nice to see a federal government document that actually talks about the way that people behave in reality, rather than a nice perfect process where we're all rational consumers, which doesn't actually exist in practice. So for the next couple of slides, let's have a quick chat about diversity. So look, personally, I think it's a bit of a debate about whether there really is a cybersecurity skills shortage, but I know for sure that there definitely is a diversity shortage in cybersecurity. So what is diversity? Diversity is, broadly speaking, broken up into two areas: your social identity and your professional identity, and it's all sorts of things. This is a really nice diagram to summarise it. And part of diversity is how you perceive yourself and how you perceive how other people perceive you. So what is inclusion? Well, inclusion is how we get the mix of diversity in organisations to work effectively together. Diversity on its own is a laudable goal, but it won't get the outcomes that we really want and need as a society and as an industry without effective inclusivity. So inclusion is all the ways that people can feel respected for who they are and able to be themselves, how they feel connected to their colleagues and their sense of belonging in an organisation, how they perceive that they're contributing their perspectives and talents to their workplace, and how they're progressing in their careers. That is, how if they're having equal access to opportunities and resources. Diversity, well, before I go on to that, I think this is a great phrase that really sums up the difference between diversity and inclusion. But diversity in cybersecurity, it's not just a moral issue. It's an issue of team success. Diverse teams are more innovative, generally perform better during crises, and are less likely to suffer from groupthink. And that in its own should be a good reason for people to be thinking carefully about they can harness the benefits of diversity in their workplace, because groupthink can be particularly corrosive to any kind of true innovation. The only way to realise these potential benefits is through effective inclusivity rather than tokenism. If diversity is only a checkbox, it doesn't deliver good results for anybody, not for individuals, not for organisations. In fact, you're very likely to result in a large number of disbenefits, both for individuals and for organisations. And that's all we had prepared in terms of our presentation proper. So if anyone's got any questions, you can ask them via the app, or you can just sing out. Am I allowed to say that, Lucas? Because I already did.
You can sing if you want.
Thank you.
There are a couple of questions. and I thought one of them's going to be answered, judging on what we discussed yesterday, but it's an abrupt stop. So, but thank you. Actually, can we get a warm round of applause? Because 6 hours of content into 35 minutes. And how long did you have to prepare?
About 24 hours.
There we go. So there was lack of sleep last night, most likely. Well done. There are a couple of questions on the Q&A app. So what questions would you suggest during the one-on-one?
Look, I suppose we had a long discussion yesterday about one-on-ones. The purpose, let's just go back to the purpose, and then we can talk about the sorts of questions one might ask. The purpose of one-on-ones is several-fold, right? You are trying to get to know, as the manager, as the leader, who your people are, and what their wants, needs, desires are as workers, right? So it should be mostly in their hands. If you're coming to them with, here's 15 questions I want to ask you, maybe the one-on-ones is not the right forum for that. Because what you're trying to do is get to know them as individuals and to build up trust, your trust of them and their trust of you. And that's done through human interaction. It's much more difficult in COVID times when you're having to do this over Zoom, and I acknowledge that. If you can go and buy somebody a coffee, on a regular basis once a week and have a quick half-hour discussion, and you might be just talking about the footy, if that's what they're into, from a national security perspective, the reason why you do that is to try and get to know your staff, because you're worried, because you need, as a manager in a national security area, to make sure that you're dealing with insider risk, insider threat. That to a lesser extent in all workplaces, but certainly from if you're working in a secure area, in a sensitive area, you're trying to work out, are there things stressing this person? Are there kids pissing them off?
Yeah, that happens.
Husband, wife, whatever. How can you help? That's what you're trying to do, because you're trying to humanize that relationship. Because, and I've said this previously, if you look, if you're an obsessive nerd about some of these things like I am, and you go and read the report on Warwick Snowden. Anyway, the spy who went to Russia. Edward Snowden. That's the one. Edward Snowden.
His brother was Warren.
Anyway, his bosses had never met him. So, and this is a guy who had TSSCI clearance. And then they're surprised that this guy is disgruntled. So, I'll leave it to you.
So one-on-ones are about gruntism, not disgruntism. Do we have another question?
There was, yes. So Queensland Government have mandated the implementation of ISMS. In your experience, what are the biggest challenges we are likely to face?
Sorry, suppose the government had implemented the ISMS.
Queensland Government have mandated we implement ISMS?
Yes. So IS 18, which is the Queensland Government Information Security Policy, and note that I am not a Queensland Government employee, so this is personal views, not the views of Queensland Government. What are the challenges in implementing an ISMS? So the big challenges are trying to get alignment between your information security management and your risk appetite within the organisation. How do you do that? By making sure that your most senior members of, in this case, your department, are involved in actually determining what your risk appetite is and what the actual tolerance to risk is within the organisation. Because that then should determine how much money they're willing to spend. Because effectively, It's the Pareto principle, 80-20. 80% of costs of mitigating a risk can be mitigated with 20% cost. The last 20% costs 80%. That's a principle. It's an overall big arching thing. So again, it's a matter of how much the CEO / board of management actually cares. And so I think it's actually getting them to focus and to own that they have information security risk and to make those hard decisions. They are accountable, in the end for making sure that the information within the organisation is secure. Now, I know that there are a few Queensland Government people here, and if you want to jump up and disagree with me, please do. But
Disappointing. No one's jumped up and disagreed. How are we going for time, Lucas?
We are over, but we're going into a break, so we may have... No, we're cutting it. I'm getting that. Get off.
Get off.
So I had a question, but I think I'll ask it after. So if anyone does have questions, please feel free to grab them in the hallway.
Yep.
Not physically, because COVID, social distancing and all that. Can we have a warm round of applause for Dr. Mark Carey-Smith and Alex
Thank you very
Webling?
much.